Yeah, so KubeCon was pretty great. It was cool to meet a whole bunch of you at the conference. A lot of people that I had only ever seen online or in pull requests got to see in 3D, which was fantastic. Um, this is the Ambient meeting, and of course, Ambient made a pretty big splash with talks at Service Mesh Con and KubeCon on the Ambient architecture. Lots and lots of demos and labs being run on it. Lots of excitement. A decent amount of confusion too, as far as what it's all about. But with innovation, that's often the case. I think that as things move towards production ready, we'll see a lot less of that. Anyone else have any takeaway thoughts on the conference?
Yeah, I think you captured it well. So definitely there's a lots of excitement around ambient. John, we are actually saying it at the same time, except you use voice. That's cool. Yeah, and it's really nice to see everybody. It's nice we had a Istio meetup for the first time after COVID. The only sad part is I think I captured some virus at the conference, so I'll do less talking.
Iris, I see you're crafting an agenda item on future Z-tunnel options. You want to talk about that?
Yes, actually, this is a question from our side. So we want to know, so currently we have a Rust-based implementation for the tunnel. So what's the future plan from the community? Will it final, recommended approach for the level 4 layer, or will there any other options also, like DPTK or some other things?
I would say that the tentative direction of the community so far has been around the Rust one that we're working on. We haven't committed to that's the one true way to do it, but we're exploring it, and there seems to be general direction that that's going to work out to be kind of the standard option. Whether that will be we just drop the Envoy one entirely, that's still to be determined. If there's other implementations other than the Rust one and the Envoy one, I think that's definitely something to explore. But right now, no one has yet talked about them except for you. So if you want to discuss it more, that would be awesome. Yeah, go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, just one bit of color. I think to merge the Envoy implementation of Z-tunnel, it would need work to get ready for upstream at least. So, and I don't know that we're going to do that work. So someone would need to contribute. I don't know if you agree with that or not, John. But.
I assume you meant the Rust one. You said Envoy.
Oh no! I think the Rust tunnel, the config isn't good enough.
Oh! I see what you mean. Okay. Okay. Yeah, merge to
the Rust one definitely needs work, but we're doing that. We're doing that work.
Yes. Yeah. I agree. In my opinion, there's no need to have an Envoy one and a Rust one because the Rust one is going to be better in every way. But I don't want to say we're going to kill the other one yet until it's actually better, because right now it's not yet complete. So.
But I mean, as I mentioned a few times, my interest is also to support proxyless gRPC and other environments. So it will probably be necessary to have some support for the protocol in all languages supported by gRPC, and presumably, have some compatibility and make sure that multiple implementations. I mean, even if we support only the Rust implementation, we focus on the Rust implementation, it should be possible to interoperate with, things like proxyless gRPC and other implementations of the same protocol, especially since it's a standard protocol.
Okay, thank you, guys. So one further question regarding the level 7 one. So will we enhance that as well? Will we have another option besides Envoy? What is the direction for community for this part?
I think L7
easy.
will.
Yeah, it's just going to be Envoy based.
There's a little bit of exploration of using the Rust Z tunnel just for HBone. or I'll say we're researching that. But Z-Tunnel will never parse L7. So L7 is always going to be Envoy.
Yeah, that's a good point. So L7 processing is definitely Envoy. Yeah, what Isa mentioned, it could potentially be interesting to reuse some of the similar code to handle edge-bone connection. We could potentially reuse that code from Z-Tunnel. I guess as far as waypoint proxy goes, the way currently the waypoint proxy is per service account, right? So we've got actually a lot of users asking about per namespace was per service account. Right now, it's all implemented per service account at the moment.
We could do per namespace. It's just a trade-off. Now you've got a waypoint that's operating on behalf of multiple keys. So I would ask what the motivation for the ask is more than anything, but there's no like technical blocker.
Yeah, the motivation for this asking is, currently the traffic flow or the traffic route is a little complex. Plus, especially if we plus the waypoint proxy here, so seems a lot of enhancement space here.
So it's just having a waypoint per service count. It seems more complex than having a waypoint per namespace. Is that a fair summary of the?
This is not my asking. I mean, per namespace or per service account. My asking is just whether we will have other option to replace MWO in layer 7 as well.
So I mean, looking back at the history of Istio, we've always talked about having data planes other than Envoy serving the traffic. L7 is a particularly difficult area to do that because of the nuances and complexity. But technically, if you came up with a data plane that was configured via XDS and did the same thing Envoy did with traffic, with all of the XDS that we send, there would be no reason that couldn't be swapped in. I think that's a pretty tall order for L7. I think it's much more achievable at L4, but it seems at least theoretically possible.
So, Louis, go ahead.
So I think there's obviously a contract between the Z-Tunnel and the waypoint that other implementations could meet, as Mitch described. It gets easier for other waypoints to meet that, and I don't think XDS, by the way, is a requirement, Mitch. If those waypoints are sandwiched by a Z-Tunnel implementation that is under the control of Istio. So as long as an L7 proxy is sandwiched in a network where the network is acting on behalf of the identity, then whatever the waypoint does, right, will maintain the identity. The only thing it would have to do is, if it wanted to support delegation, right, it would have to do identity propagation at L7, right? But it could act as and talk as the identity simply by being embedded in an interface that had that identity, right? It doesn't get all the way there, but it gets you quite far.
And I want to reiterate, for proxyless gRPC, which we support in Istio open source, they will need to implement at least a subset, because it's L7. So if they want to keep doing proxyless, they will probably need to implement some of the features of the waypoint. So I don't think, it will not be complete, but just like it's not complete Istio support, but it will need some, multiple language implementation of a subset of the protocol at least with XDS support.
Right, and this would be true for any like a theoretical L4 bump in the wire solution as well, right? Like ignoring L7. What if you wanted to put a firewall, right, in? A firewall is just an L4 waypoint instead of an L7 waypoint. So I think this discussion really has a bearing on how do we want to compose waypoint with the Z-Tunnel implementation. If we layer them, it's easier to swap Envoy with something else. If we embed, it's harder.
do we want to replace it again? Sorry. Do we want to?
I don't know if we necessarily want to replace with Envoy, but we might want to replace with a different controller of Envoy, right? Or a different flavor of Envoy, right? Or other vendors may provide their own implementations of Envoy, right? That are still meeting those requirements. And how would the control plane know?
But
Right.
that's open today, right? And the answer for it is the Envoy filter if you want to extend, right?
No. This is a compositional problem, right? How does a Z tunnel know that there's a waypoint?
Ah, got it.
Right? What is that? How is that contract expressed? Right now, it's expressed as code inside the SDOD runtime. It could be expressed at a higher level.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Louis, that would look similar to like service entry, where it's a non-native network entity that we're sort of making the Z tunnel aware of. Is that right?
And one way to do it, for instance, as a straw man, since waypoints are enabled with the gateway API, you could write the IP address of the waypoint back into the status field of the gateway. And that would tell the control plane, here are the IPs for the waypoints. Whatever they were, right? So that's a way of expressing a compositional contract. Then
Also-
whatever was the gateway controller would write those IPs in, and it would be up to the provider of the waypoint class to make sure that they functioned.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to add the workload API right now that's been merged. It has the waypoint address, which is the optional field, right? So if the control plane sends down to the data plane with the waypoint address, then it knows if it has a waypoint address.
Right, that's the downward facing API to the Z tunnel, right? We're talking about an upward API to the control plane.
Oh, got you. Okay, yeah.
Or maybe I had that backwards. I can't remember which way is up.
Yeah, but I think I know the way you are saying. Yeah, so that's from control plane to the data plane. You're talking about from the waypoint proxy back to the control plane.
From the waypoint controller to the Z tunnel control plane.
Waypoint controller, which is the gateway controller that stand up the gateway. Okay. Back to- And that would be useful only if the Z tunnel doesn't receive like the workload information from the Istio control plane, right?
No, that's a way to tell the Istio control plane what the workloads are, where the waypoints are.
Okay, and then which could use that information to render the workload and resources, whether it has the optional waypoint address when sending from the Istio control plane to Z tunnel.
Well, imagine we had two control planes, right? A Z tunnel control plane and a waypoint control plane, and they have to interoperate. And they were in two different, like they were literally two different binaries. How would they communicate? Right? It's a way, this is how they would communicate, or an example of a way that they could communicate.
Having in the status field of the waypoint proxy, okay, as the IP, yeah.
So then basically any implementer of the gateway API using sort of the Gamma standard could serve as an L7 waypoint for Ambient.
Yes. Or another way of saying is you could swap the waypoint controller with a different waypoint controller.
I would say not of a Gamma. Any gateway implementation of the gateway API could serve as a waypoint if they support, kind of if they use Z-tunnel or if they support some.
They need to support east-west, but I would defer to John and Keith on that one.
Yeah.
Got it.
Right.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So that's one example of how, right? And maybe it's not the right one, but it's certainly an example and a pretty typical usage of the controller pattern to achieve the effect. The second question is, how much work is it right, to be an alternate implementation of a waypoint. Right? Today, it would be very hard. If we sandwich, it would be a lot easier. Right, and so there's that kind of compositional discussion at the data plane level as well, if we wanted to facilitate alternates.
Yeah, so I think the key is, does anybody needs an alternative solution for waypoint proxy for layer 7 processing other than Envoy? I guess from the conference, I haven't heard anybody else asking. Eris, curious if you had anybody asking.
I really think it's overkill and overcomplicated. Why do we need this?
Yeah.
That's what I don't 100% understand.
So we may not need things other than Envoy, but we almost certainly need different Envoy controllers.
Yeah. For instance, it did the Solo API gateway controller, right? Istio's said we're not going to implement API gateway features, but Solo has built some really cool stuff on top of Envoy for API gateways. You could have that API gateway work within the mesh without needing an additional Istio waypoint in order to serve it.
But I can do this today, correct?
How?
Not with the Envoy filter. Why can't I just extend that and with the Envoy filter resource that we have? Like if right now I have some filter that I built to Envoy, right? And I wanted to support that, and this is something that Istio is not supporting today. What am I going to do? I'm going to use the Envoy filter resource, going to put whatever I want, send it directly to Istio, to Envoy. Is that fair or not?
So, I mean, if Envoy filter meets that functional requirement, then you can do it with Envoy filter. Well, we have our own set of issues with Envoy filter. If it doesn't, right, then you're stuck.
So we want to do, so what it is basically a different way to create a extensibility.
Well, how about this? Like, I'm a
Yeah.
cloud vendor,
Mhm.
and I want my waypoint to use my fully managed load balancer, not the one running in cluster. How would I do that?
Yeah, that's exactly my question here. Let's say I'm on AWS. If I have my own, proprietary waypoint implementation, which is controlled by my AWS Gateway API controller, which understands user-specified gateway API object, it will reconcile into my underlying whatever the data plane construct. Would that work in this model? And then on top of that, you can run SDO to do this. Just curious.
I think the question is always, will it be supported by the Istio community, or is it supported by the design and you need to implement some stuff? I mean, because the whole idea with the H-bond protocol and following standard was exactly to enable this kind of use cases. So vendors like Google, AWS can implement their own multi-tenant, custom solutions, including proxyless gRPC and all the others. But that doesn't mean the Istio open source community will do the work or will support this. It just means that we follow a common protocol, and any vendor and other people who want to integrate with us, they do the work and with whatever languages and tools they need. At least that's my I mean, the reason we spend so much time trying to discuss the protocol and use Connect and use Mask and all the discussions were in large part to enable interoperability and reuse of tools, not single solution.
Right. So the data plane interoperability aspects of HBone are moot if we can't point at alternate data plane implementations.
Okay. Yeah. So this is assumption I have made. If we implement HBone, zTunnel, and follow the spec, and we also implement the gateway controller, we'll convert the gateway object to whatever underlying configuration. But that's my question. Okay, so it's possible architecturally will work if running SDOD on top of that. We'll write on top of the gateway API and it will automatically reconcile into our underlying VPC data plane configuration.
You don't actually need to use HistioD or XDS or anything. I mean, that's what Louis said earlier. I mean, you can use whatever control plane or you want. The main requirement is that on data plane, we have compatibility. I mean, it's the same header, same protocol, same port, same discovery. In fact, even browsers today support very similar protocols. So Firefox, Chrome, they based on the same mechanism. So we should be able to have complete interoperability and as many tools as necessary.
Yeah,
But you need to only support Envoy, of course. I mean, you don't have resources.
right. I think ideally is the user will use a common language to specify their desire, right? And then we'll reconcile into whatever the underlying configuration, data plane configuration.
How will the user know what features L7 feature set is supported if it's all going to be different implementations?
That's a hard question. I don't think anyone has an answer, even in Kubernetes Gate or anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's user choice, right, Yuval? Right? Like if you choose to do something beyond the realms of Istio, right, we're just facilitating an integration. Like just like with the solo API gateway, right? Like Istio knows nothing about what it does. Like we have no idea. Right? You integrate with it using the Envoy filter mechanism, but Istio had like no idea what's happening. And it's up to the user and your contract with them for you to make that coherent. Same for any other product.
Yeah, so I guess with the example of solo APIs, you're basically guaranteed that what you'll get is a superset of what ETO offers.
No, actually, like if we allowed other waypoints, and those waypoints have their own APIs for controlling them, there's no guarantee that they're a superset of anything.
Yeah, no, that's exactly my point.
Right. Yeah.
I'm
So
saying
right from Istio's perspective, right? Like Solo is saying we're going to give you a superset of Istio. Some other vendor might say we're going to give you a totally orthogonal set of features, right? Like firewall company X says we don't do anything at L7 at all. All we do is implement, a firewall, right? And we have our own API for that. And if you enable that with this mechanism, then that's what you get. And the Istio L7 APIs do not apply. And it's up to a customer to make a choice if they want that behavior or not.
So it'd be on the customer to support the zTunnel, sorry, not the vendor, I guess, to support the zTunnel protocol as well.
Yes.
And provide its own APIs. And the main thing we're adding here is the ability for zTunnel to talk to a custom waypoint. So we're not talking about removing the support from Istio, just
Oh no, not at all. No.
yeah.
Like what I expect most users to do, right, and what we've seen historically in service mesh is they want a holistic solution that's well specified in open source, right? And that's what Istio would represent. But if you want to layer a capability into that solution, the ability to compose waypoints, even chains of waypoints, is probably going to be useful. Now, I'm not suggesting that we try and deliver that in a, in an alpha release or something like that. We should at least consider it and not lock ourselves out with that possibility. And pragmatically speaking, we should probably enable it. It's going to be useful.
If we can find a first implementer, we could work with them to set up conformance testing for whatever conformance is needed there.
Right. Right. So a useful way of thinking about this logically right, is there's a z-tunnel control plane and a waypoint control plane. SDOD happens to be both at the same time. But if you wanted to have a different waypoint control plane, how would the z-tunnel control plane know about it and leverage it?
So let's think of one second implementation data. What does it mean to do something like that? It means to change the control plane in order to support, and how do they communicate to each other?
Yeah, I mean, if you look today,
Yeah.
right, like if you want two things to interoperate, there has to be a contract between them. The in Kubernetes today is to write state back to status that then some other system takes a dependency on. It's super common.
Or labels.
Like look at the control, like look at Cassandra, right, or any one of those things, right? My SQL controllers, or they all do this type of stuff.
Yeah.
There are also labels, naming conventions. There are all kind of options. We can choose some. I mean, it's not necessarily that status is the only way, but status is very common in gateway and other stuff. Yeah.
Now, I'm not suggesting that we go and chop Istio in half. Right? I don't think that's practical, at least not in the short term. But the contract can still be maintained even if we're still shipping a monolithic control plane for both z-tunnel and waypoint. It's not hard, right? And it probably behooves us to be a little cognizant of what other vendors are going to want. Like z-tunnel is going to make, like, if you're Palo Alto, like hardened MTLS, right, with all the best security best practice, is going to make your Palo Alto firewall not particularly useful, right? And if I'm a CISO and I just paid $5 million for my Palo Alto firewall, but I want zero trust, I'm going to probably go lean on some people with my own organization to go figure that out. And if we don't offer them something, right, it's going to create adoption friction. The better answer would be, hey, Palo Alto, go implement HPhone, become a waypoint.
Louis, should we start, kind of, since we have the discussion and there are options being discussed, and should we have a doc and list those options and try to kind of standardize on, because we standardize on the protocol, maybe we should standardize on discovery, and, I'm sure it'll be a bike shedding, it will take a while to agree, but it will be good.
Yeah, I was just trying to point out that this topic is another area where we probably need to have some formal definition, or at least consider it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I want to make sure, like, does this make sense to people, right? Is this, if everybody's vehemently against doing this, then we shouldn't do it. But if people think this makes sense, then if people feel like they need some form of compositional control.
The idea that we could do everything in the Istio project that a user ever might need from a network, I think, has not stood the test of time. Well, that was never really the idea, but as time goes by, it becomes more and more clear that we need interoperability.
Even if no vendor wants to interoperate or spends the time to interoperate, it is still useful for us to have clear contracts, because in the past we had all kinds of upgrade problems. We had all kinds of, if users give a version. So unless we have strict contracts for the core things, we'll keep having these kind of problems, because in Istio that was, we kept changing underneath, treat everything as implementation detail, and we paid the price.
Yeah, I mean, if we released a new revision of Istio into the same cluster, and it took over some of the waypoints, but the other Istio was controlling some of the Z-tunnels, right? There would need to be something that allowed them to cooperate.
So implementation details, all basically you suggested right now, correct me if I'm wrong, is basically a way, the way it's working right now, how to tie basically Z-tunnel and the waypoint is basically done by whatever data or whatever. And now what you suggested, instead of it, let's make sure that in the control plane of SDO, we are putting it in the status and taking it from the status.
Or something like that, right? Like I'm not actually stipulating the solution.
No, but you mean other way to basically move the state between them that it's not through the request itself. That's basically what you're saying. Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's not a lot of work, which is fine.
Yeah, no, I'm guessing it's probably not a lot of work. Right? It's probably going to have some benefits.
We can just standard document exactly what was done today and treat it as a standard. That's a baseline. And maybe good enough. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. In the we didn't need to define something, right? Some form of contract.
How would identity work there? We would need an authenticatable identity for the L7 waypoint that the Z-tunnel could authenticate mutually, right?
Yeah, it still has to go get an identity, right? It has to participate in MTLS. Right.
So
One way to do that is
same-
to use a Z-tunnel, right, and be in a sandwich, right?
We needed to use the same root of trust then?
Or federated, but
Okay.
let's say for sake of argument right now, same.
Yeah, probably that. But I think it's what the most important decision here is if we want to support delegation or we want to keep the current model, or we want to support both or something like that, because delegation is super useful in a lot of cases where, Envoy trusts something in front of it to do the authentication, and it does the sandwich, I mean, the tunnel in front of it, or some other gateways that is authenticated through to other means. Right now, we just rely on the fact that the waypoint has, the credentials signed by that particular identity, which creates a requirement to have pair service account waypoints. And I know that delegation is complicated and require a lot of work, but it may be worth starting that.
Right. Like ultimately, we're probably going to want to have east-west gateways that are terminating and delegating, right, for policy control reasons.
And the fully multi-tenant that some vendors may use.
Okay. Which basically a policy control reason, right, custom. So do people think that having this contract is a good idea? Or at least designing so that we can have one?
Yeah, I think it's fine. I mean, it's not to me a top priority in the short term because there's no other waypoints right now. But we should keep it in mind, and
Iris, Liwen, you both had questions along these lines. Does it make sense as a direction?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I think if we can have a document and make the contract clear to everybody, then it will be beneficial for long term as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it detracts anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with John. I mean, it's certainly not a high priority thing. One thing I do want us to also think through as part of the contract is what if the user not deploy waypoint proxy using the gateway API? Is gateway API the status the only way as part of the contract?
Yeah, I mean, we can debate the mechanisms, Lynn.
Okay. John, did you want to say something too?
Yeah, it was for a different topic. I agree with Leo
Okay.
on that question. My other question was, we talked a lot about swapping out the waypoint. I think Iris's original question was swapping out the Z-tunnel. Is there desire there to define like what it means to be a Z-tunnel?
I think that one thing that is very important to us in Solo is that we don't want to reinvent SDO. Endpoint. So, we feel that what's special about making it in Rust and the way we describe is that it's very, very important that it will be a very small piece that is doing very, very little, and that's what it should do. And we don't want it to support crazy stuff like layer 7, in my opinion. They shouldn't live there. So the only thing that I want to make sure is that eventually what I don't want to get us to a point that we're rebuilding Envoy. That just, to me, is not a good use of our time, honestly. So, in my opinion, but left to what other people think. But if the purpose is to make it as important as, for instance, the kube proxy or something like that, and it should be very, very clear what it's doing. It should be very, very small and low prices and very, very solid, because that becomes such an important piece of your infrastructure. So yeah, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I guess what I was getting at is like if Iris or someone else wants to go implement a Z-tunnel and DK or whatever, but like we could definitely add a spec for what it means to be a Z-tunnel. Obviously, the non-formal spec is like just swap it out and make sure all the tests still pass, right? But we can make a more formal spec if it comes to that.
We continue. We're planning going forward to continue supporting STO as Envoy as a Z-tunnel, or that the idea is to basically get deprecated.
I think we'll probably deprecate it, but we haven't decided yet, mostly because the Z-tunnel isn't yet better than Envoy in every way. Like it doesn't support all the functionality yet, just because we just started, working on it a couple weeks ago. So,
well, it's definitely a goal for Istio to support only one implementation.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought too, but I think Ethan had suggested otherwise. But if everyone's nodding, then I nod as well.
That's not what I was suggesting. I was saying we're not planning to invest in making Envoy production quality. But
okay, yeah. No, I mean, for me, I totally agree. Like we should have one. It should be the best one, and if someone else wants to do another one, that's fine. I don't think anyone will want to do an Envoy one. They'll want to do like some other optimized thing.
Yeah, if a vendor wants to go implement their own Z-tunnel in, God knows what, for God knows what reason, they are welcome to do it. And as John said, the testing requirement is it must drop in and continue to function.
So to double confirm, the future direction for the Z-tunnel part is the Rust-based implementation, right?
I think that right. Ethan, John, maybe you should answer that question.
yes, we'll have more confidence as the implementation comes together. But right now, at least at Google, we're operating under that assumption, and we're investing engineering resources to make that happen.
I think another way of saying, Iris, there will only ever be one that we maintain. What it is may change over time, but right now, it is assumed that it will be the Rust one.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. When we want to contribute to Ambient, currently there are some bugs around, if we leverage Envoy and Z-tunnel, there are some issues. And if we go to the Rust implementation, there are also some issues. So for the community's perspective, for a contributor, if they need to contribute, which direction they should select to make sure the Envoy version workable or make the Rust version workable. So yeah, this is some question for us.
Yeah, I mean, so we can't really dictate what the community does, but I'll tell you, Google is investing only really in the Rust implementation from an engineering perspective today. We're also working on publishing a roadmap of GitHub issues and all that sort of stuff. Steven's got it almost all the way there, but we're hoping to have that next week or so to make it a little easier to contribute. So I think the Rust implementation is the correct bet if you're going to fix bugs and contribute.
And also, there's other work in Ambient aside from Z-tunnel. So I think the Z-tunnel is in Rust is most likely the direction for Z-tunnel. But if you are looking just to contribute to Ambient generally, there are other areas outside of Z-tunnel to contribute as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Opinion on question to Iris one. So EMOS still will be a waypoint implementation. So there will be something we can enhancement for the Envoy. So the question is there any issue or document or plan to list those enhancement point for the Envoy, so people can contribute it. By the way, this is Alex. I'm a Envoy developer from the Intel.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Was it that what other work could be done for Envoy for waypoints, or?
Yeah, what's work can be done for the Envoy for a waypoint? Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think we have a doc. I was gonna see if I could pull it up. That John wrote some work that needed to be done still for Ambient. See if I can pull that up. Or
Yeah,
So
are you-
John, you've got a list of
have a-
issues, right?
Yep, we have a GitHub issue. I can share it out.
On that area, Ethan, I think the work in Envoy is pretty dependent on the sandwich, no sandwich question, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the first, and there's a particularly, yeah. I don't want to dig into it too much here, but we need to make that decision. Here's the short summary. The XDS path in the L7 waypoint is more complicated than I would like it to be. And according to Quat, who's our internal Envoy expert, if we did the sandwiching, it would make the XDS and L7 waypoint dramatically simpler. But there's some technical challenges to figure out like the details of how to actually do the sandwiching. So that's kind of on, I mean, if someone wants to take on thinking about that, I'd love to talk to them, but that's on our roadmap to at least make a proposal to kind of make it easier to get started.
Ethan,
Also-
maybe you could get Quat and Alex together. So at least
Sure.
Quat can help bring Alex up to speed, and maybe Alex can help.
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah,
Alex,
also-
I'll reach
I
out.
saw the
I'll
link.
reach out to you out of
Thank
it.
you. Thank you, guys.
So
Does everybody understands what we mean by the sandwich? I assume most people do. Right? Silence is assent. So yes.
So, Louis, for sandwich, there are some other benefits, in simplification, other things, but I think the important things that we need to discuss is how we are going to pass the information from the tunnel and standardize a bit. And that's kind of delegation, effectively, because it's a way to try to pass certificate information and other stuff from the Z tunnel to Envoy.
Yes.
That's how-
Identity information. Yes. And possibly, Kos and I were discussing this earlier. The other advantage of sandwiching means that we have to formalize a contract between the Z-tunnel layer and the waypoint for propagating of identity for policy reasons. That contract could also be used by other things like gRPC or other user-level libraries that exist without the waypoint but sit on top of the Z-tunnel network for policy enforcement.
Because actually, that's a regression in current Ambient. In Istio, for example, an application can get information about the certificates, at least for HTTP, through some headers. In Ambient right now, we lack a way to do it. So Sandwich would force us to define a clear interface between Z-tunnel and applications to get metadata. Right.
Yeah. So the historical analog here is when you run on a VM, you can call your metadata server and ask, "Who am I?" This is, I can ask the network, "Who is my peer?" Right, and have the network give you back either an assertion or a proof. Right? We're likely to start with assertions. I'm not sure when we'll do proofs, but.
And Louis, the sandwich we're talking about is just Z-tunnel to waypoint to Z-tunnel.
Yes. So the Z-tunnel is just an interface that the waypoint listens on.
Great.
And talks to.
So Louis, you just mentioned some sandwich things. So is this the contract between the Z-tunnel and the waypoint? Can you share more details around this to make sure we are clear?
Right now, it's the level of detail is conceptual.
Okay.
I think we need a more detailed design document about how we want to express it, and what are the options for expressing it.
Okay, thank you. So Ethan said he will follow up.
Yes, I will follow up. I just want to set expectations. This is in like very early concept phase. So we're in the like we'd love to participate with people to figure out what to do here. It's not, I don't have like a design doc.
Oh, you mean follow up with the question from Alex, right? I originally think you will follow up with the documentation, the contract part.
Oh yeah, I'll follow up with the question from Alex. Yeah, there is no documentation because we're not at that stage yet.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
we
you.
could probably have this could probably be tracked at the level of a GitHub issue, right?
I'll write a GitHub issue. I think that will. I'll write a GitHub issue containing the sum total of my knowledge on the subject, which is limited, but not zero. Yeah.
So back to the Savage thing, there will be a document to describe the at least at the concept level, right?
I think we just
I'm
said
going to write a
GitHub
GitHub issue
issue.
that describes the concept.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not complicated. It's run ztunnel as a sidecar alongside Envoy, and let ztunnel handle HMON. That's the concept. But
Yeah.
Or more generally, there's a network. The network can tell you the identity of your peer in a reliable fashion, and ztunnel is an implementation of a network that can do that.
sure.
Yeah.
And then what does that do to the waypoint in terms of configuration, complexity, et cetera, et cetera? Because you don't have to tell Envoy about MTLS anymore, or lots of other things. Does that make
that
sense,
help?
Iris? Or Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, would that help us also trim down waypoint proxy? And I assume this would be not only used by the Istio's waypoint proxy, but also whoever choose to implement its own waypoint proxy, they could potentially run the ztunnel as a sidecar that implements Etchable also.
Yes, it would make it easier to implement an alternate waypoint because you wouldn't have to do all of the HBone things.
Yeah.
And it would make it easier to implement our waypoint because a lot of the complexity in our current implementation is due to the HBone implementation.
Yeah, if there's a general theme of Ambient, it's layering is good, right? This is just one more example of that in action.
Yeah.
Right, the getting the code to work, to make what ztunnel would do work inside of Envoy, right, was painful? Is that the right term to use?
Yes.
But we also probably even can simplify some of the standard Envoy sidecar deployments as well, because there's already logic like to sniff to determine whether it's MTLS encrypted or not. So all of that can also be stripped out. So there's a lot of simplification, I think, that can come with this, even for existing non-ambient.
Yeah, I mean, the existing non-ambient, the sidecar could switch to two sidecars, right, where the Envoy gets a lot simpler. I haven't fully wrapped my head around that one yet, Justin, but it'll be interesting to see how that works out. I suspect you're right as well, actually. It will probably end up being better.
Yeah,
So
either
there's
two
some more-
sidecar. Yeah, either two sidecar or maybe one sidecar, but we run two process. I'm not sure how that works. Yeah, but running two sidecar seems pretty complicated. We use only needs one sidecar today.
We have to make up for all those sidecars we got rid of with Ambient.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting we recommend that as a solution, but as a an upgrade path to Ambient.
That's interesting. So it can help smooth out the upgrade experience
Maybe.
because they
right.
would be already running zTunnel in some fashion in the sidecar mode.
Right. I mean, certainly you can run zTunnel as a sidecar, right? If you just want an L4 sidecar, let's say you have a VM, right, and we don't have per node control, I suspect we'll need that ability for VMs.
I think I have a question on the whole stack. I saw some conversation happen on the Slack that between the pod and zTunnel, there's some quite complex, wiring and has to set up, like using Geneve tunnel or something. Would that be simplified or documented somewhere? It's kind of mystery. How does the life of the packet traverse from pod to zTunnel?
Yeah, at a high level, this is really a function of what the CNI does. So the correct solution to this is each CNI vendor needs to implement kind of native support for zTunnel. In the experimental launch, we kind of hacked around it because we didn't have kind of formal support from any particular CNI vendor. I don't think that will be kind of what the long-term production path for this will be. But I also don't think Istio can dictate how that redirection happens because it's highly dependent on what the CNI is. For example, in Celium, they'll probably use BPF to redirect to zTunnel. In Calico, they'll do something else based on IP tables, etc. So that's kind of a separate project that we need to track getting native support for this into various CNIs. Yeah. There's no documentation on the series of hacks we did to get it to work. I could talk about it or possibly write something down, but I don't think those hacks will persist in the long term. So
okay,
Yeah, both Solo and Isovalent have expressed interest in modifying Cilium so that we have a much cleaner way to get packets in and out of pods and into zTunnels. So, in the future, we should have alternatives that are much cleaner than the current kind of hacky Genep tunnel way.
Got it. Thank you.
Also not only on Cilium. We should just be very...
Right. Yeah. Sorry. That was just an example of Cilium is one of the platforms but we had very concrete discussions about that. But yeah, we would want to make it work with other vendors, other CNI options as well.
Yeah, I think we want to, Ethan, you and I discussed starting to open up some tracking bugs with some of the other CNI vendors just to get those discussions going out in the open.
It would be interesting to me to know what the most popular CNIs are. There's Celium and whatever's kind of built into Kubernetes.
It's Calico.
Is Calico still?
Calico is the one.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of people using Calico, or they're using the native solution that they are getting from the provider, like a Red Hat or any other the cloud provider that's giving them whatever they're giving them.
Yeah.
Specifically, when I talk to my customers, none of them care too much about that. They were excited about the fact that it's working. And I will quote, for instance, Chick-fil-A, who said, I really don't care to get 0.0000 millisecond back to my application. I don't care. So just FYI.
Yeah, I think we also probably want a less hacky but universal way, if we can get one in Istio, right, that works with most of the CNI vendors out of the box without necessarily having to take a hard dependency on them. Right, and Ethan, there's still opportunities to dig in on that as well, right?
Yes. Sorry, I was responding to a really interesting question you've all had in chat and did not.
Yeah, can
fully
you
back or something.
I see a lot of text. Can you guys explain why you don't? You are asking some questions?
Yeah, we're getting very much into the weeds with the sandwich, the tunnel sandwich stuff. Yuval, actually, you in particular, I would love to talk about this with out of band, because you're going to have really interesting ideas on it. If you're free, I'll email you and we can schedule a time. Yeah.
Yeah, then tomorrow we have this company event, but anytime after.
Okay.
Luan, you asked about SIG-V4. Can you bring that up in this Slack channel? Maybe reference some technical documentation about it.
Sure, yeah.
It's like Jot.
Yeah, it's
I vaguely remember it, but I'm not familiar with the details.
Right. So it's like paths associated service account associated to a token, and they can use that to use the SIG-V4 is a well-known algorithm you can sign. And our infrastructure, we can look at the signature. Our server can find out who's the caller, the account ID, all those kind of information associated with that user on AWS.
So is it a bearer token or is it a channel bound token?
I think it's I'm not a crypto expert. I'll forward the information on that. It's basically it's a service account. You associate a service account to a OIDC, and then you get a static token on the pod, and the application can call API to say, I want to assume this role. I will get a temporary key from AWS infrastructure, and you sign your header, and then you get a long signature. And that signature gets sent to infrastructure on the receiving, let's say a waypoint, will receive the HTTP connect, including the SIG-V4 header. And then we'll just send the string to our server. The server will come back to say, hey, this is Li-Wen, this is her role, the role, read role, and we'll associate whatever the policy with that role. Everything just like any other AWS service.
Okay, yeah, it's a bearer token.
Yeah.
But it has a centralized revocation control by the sounds of it.
Exactly. It's already in the infrastructure. We don't have to build the underlying, the key distribution, the policy. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's an interesting discussion to be had for zTunnel about whether when zTunnel originates streams, right, should we also have tokens in those streams in addition to the identity being used at the channel level to enable systems to support delegation in addition to channel identity? It's a quite complicated topic. So one we have to have with some more security folks here at Google too. But certainly whenever the delegation is occurring, right, you need some of those capabilities if you want to maintain end-to-end security properties.
I would say for zTunnel and the sandwich for Waypoint, we should keep it as simple as possible. But this kind of JOT tokens and delegation for ingress, egress, east-west, and so forth, that will be a bigger topic, and probably not necessarily ambient specific, because the entire Istio has similar problems and needs to integrate with other gateways and with infrastructure. So maybe we can move it to the previous meeting to Istio and implement it. We can already implement it in Istio gateways and other things.
Okay, folks, I got to run. We're out of time.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.